Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations about Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and joining me is Anthony Tresca.
Oh, hello.
That was super creepy.
I will never... Let me try it again. Set me up again.
And this is, hopefully, a less creepy version of Anthony Tresca.
Hello!
Yay, much better. So, this is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so thankful and excited that you are joining us today for our discussion over the 2019 film, The Dead Don't Die.
The Dead Don't Die is a horror comedy, which if you've been listening to our podcast before, you know that Anthony and I are particularly fond of horror comedies.
There are bread and butter.
They are just filled with just weirdness in this episode. That's exciting. And they are...
Off to a good weird start, which is, you know what? It's very fitting for this film.
It is, but much as I don't care 100% for the film, I may not care 100% for this version of Anthony. We will have to see as the episode progresses.
We'll do a review at the end of the episode.
That's nice. So that's something, though, that I want to make clear, that oftentimes, especially with horror comedy, we're really very much in agreement. We are not quite in agreement with this film. Anthony liked it more than I did. I don't know if you would say that, like, what did you end up giving it in terms of, like...
I gave it a 3 out of 5.
That's not bad. And you have to know, listeners, that Anthony is a very harsh grader of his films. So a 3 is actually really rather high.
Well, because average is 2.5.
Yeah.
That's like, if a film is fine, it gets a 2.5. You have to do a little something extra to get a 3 from me.
And see, whereas I would probably give the average film a 3, just because I feel like that's a better number for me as the average, I would give this film more like a 1 to 1.5. So we are going to be in some disagreement for this episode.
That sounds like a pretty big disagreement.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's 50% different. So that'll be exciting. But we thought, as usual, that we would begin with a critical framework. And I, because of my more or less apathy towards this film, asked Anthony what he thought I should do. And he made a very good recommendation, which was to set us up for a discussion of one of the film's features, whether or not that's a redeeming feature, is up for discussion. And that is the sort of meta-narrative, ironic, very aware of itself.
The entire film just is drenched in irony. You cut it open, it's filled with irony. Everything it does is irony.
Yeah, see, and I guess I can't entirely agree with that, because if it had been more of that, I think I would have liked it more. I think that when it was at its sharpest, it was when it was doing that at the best, but there were just moments that it just fell to pieces. But before we get there...
We'll get into that.
We will get into that. Before that, though, I want to talk about a text that is pretty well recognized in horror scholarship, and that is the 1996 article, Recreational Terror, Postmodern Elements of the Contemporary Horror Film by Isabel Pinedo. This text sort of sets up what we think of when we think about what postmodern horror looks like. And postmodernism has never been my particular cup of tea, because it's often much more experimental and odd and less sort of fixed than I usually like, which is one of the reasons I don't like this film.
And I feel like it's not going to come as much of a surprise to you when I say I do like postmodern things.
Whereas the classes in college that I disliked the most as an English major were the like postmodern poetry. I was like, please make it stop.
Well, I can agree with you on most postmodern poetry,
but even like theater, like it's just not my cup of tea. I know. And partially because that term postmodern it's by design intended to be really experimental, and it's intended to be pushing against what was the modernist movement, and that means that it's often just different. And that's not like the best definition of postmodernism, but it's the fastest. So in her article, Pinedo begins by sort of talking about like what is the postmodern movement and how is that a break or a shift from modernism, and how can we conceptualize it and how does it look, and she spends, before she even gets to horror, she just kind of has to talk about this term that often has a very large and difficult to define definition. But when she gets to her definition of postmodern horror, she more or less offers 5 characteristics that, you know, like 2 decades in advance could have foretold The Dead Don't Die.
Indeed.
And so she says that this is a quote from her, despite the enormous breadth of films that fall under the rubric of horror, there are identifiable elements that define horror in general, classic horror, and postmodern horror. And then she says, here are the 5 characteristics that she thinks constitute postmodern horror. 1, there is a violent disruption of the everyday world. 2, there is a transgression and violation of boundaries. 3, the validity of rationality is thrown into question. 4, there is no narrative closure. And 5, the film produces a bounded experience of fear. And by that last one, she really means that there are some horror films that when we leave them, we're like, wow, humanity's terrible, and that's fantastic. Now I'm going to have to dwell in this pit of darkness for a while.
Like that Martyrs, for example.
Whereas, although some of Martyrs, I think you could very much say is postmodern.
But in the end, I think it doesn't ultimately meet all of these characteristics.
No, it doesn't. Whereas films like Cabin in the Woods, right, is another good example of a pretty clear postmodern horror film. One that I actually really like. So anyway, I think that these criteria really nicely set up The Dead Don't Die. And
I mean, honestly, if you had told me that you were just like reading from like a New York Times article about this film and this is how they described the exact plot, I would have believed you.
Yeah, because you can tell that this is a film where they are very aware of the tropes of the genre, of the players of the genre, of everything that the genre sort of does, and they're just sort of pivoting it and putting it on its head. And while I think in moments it does work, I just, in other moments, really feel it doesn't.
Yeah. Agree to disagree.
Yeah, we can do that. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about the background of the film?
So, The Dead Don't Die, 2019 American horror comedy film, written and directed by Jim Jarmusch. It features an ensemble cast that includes Bill Murray, Adam Driver, Steve Buscemi, RZA, Tilda Swinton, Tom Waits, Danny Glover, Caleb Landry Jones, Carol Kane, and Selena Gomez.
I mean, really, and there are many things that I don't like about the film, but the acting was not one of them.
Right.
Like, the characters as portrayed by the actors are just
indeed. It's fitting that this film was advertised as the greatest zombie cast ever disassembled.
Yeah.
It's fitting. The cast is worthy of that name and that wordplay, I would say. So the writer and director of this is Jim Jarmusch, who is, if you're into like counterculture and like weird experimental type films and projects,
which I'm not,
which you're not, but dear listeners, if you are, this guy's you probably know who he is, because he's an American film director, screenwriter, actor, producer, editor, and music composer. He's been a major proponent of independent cinema since the 1980s, directing films like Stranger Than Paradise, Stranger Than Paradise, Ghost Dog, The Way of the Samurai, Coffee and Cigarettes, Broken Flowers, Only Lovers Left Alive, and Patterson. And he's also worked as a musician, composing music for his films and releasing 2 albums. He's a very weird dude. He's very much into like this countercultural approach to the world. He talked about it in an interview. He only puts a film by as protection of his rights, but he doesn't really believe in what that means. So he's just like the navigator of the ship, but he's not the captain. He kind of just lets everyone be involved, he says. As I've said before, it's like seduction, wild sex, and then pregnancy in the editing room. That's how it feels for me.
That is so gross. And I think it's important, like, to put this in context. Most of the people that have written and directed these horror films are a little quirky, right? Like, most of them are a little bit odd ducks. Not just because I think horror draws those people, but also because just the act of creating, right? Like creators, be they actors, writers, directors, they're just going to be a little odd. So when you say that somebody is peculiar, right? Like that means they're really peculiar. And I think that quote about the wild sex and pregnancy is a pretty good...
It's a pretty good indicator of this guy and, like, what he's about.
Yeah.
He also believes, he's a firm believer that nothing is original. So you should actively steal from anything that resonates with you or inspires you, fuels your imagination. So he's a big proponent of just, like, consuming as much media and content as possible, looking around at things outside, trees, street signs, clouds, body of water, light, shadows that inspire you, and then just directly steal and take from them. Do whatever you want with that.
Which, you know, that's what I do, is I steal my best material from trees.
Yeah, I mean...
So, you know, I'm like, that leaf. That reminds me of an article. Yeah, so that's how I personally operate. So this is good.
And there's a Guardian article that was written about him in 2004 called A Talk on the Wild Side. That just talks about how weird and quirky he is. They describe him as every bit as cool as his characters. Shades, silver chains attached to his black pants, that thick white hair that he's had forever, and a deep, deep voice. But he's also as uncool as his characters. He looks a little anachronistic, is a little uncertain about whether to smoke, and, despite the great voice, fails to catch the waitress's attention.
I actually rather like that description, that idea that he's simultaneously as cool and uncool as his characters, which, if you think about the characters of Dead Don't Die, is like the perfect way to describe someone. Like, picture the best and worst attributes of these characters, and that's what the creators really like. Like, that's actually a fantastic description.
Yeah, very apt. And I imagine that applies to almost all of his films and everything he's done. So the production for this film, it was announced during the press tour in February of 2018 during Isle of Dogs, which both Bill Murray and Tilda Swinton were on. They announced their involvement in this zombie film. Then in March of 2018, Murray confirmed that Daniel Craig was going to be in it and co-star. Which ultimately, as we know, didn't end up happening. Speaking of the project, Murray said in an interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer, while discussing his touring variety show, that he says, "It's a zombie movie. Jim has written a zombie script that's so hilarious and has a great cast of actors. It shoots over the summer, but no, I will not play a zombie."
You know, I feel one of the ways I would have been more okay with this film is if it hadn't been promoted and sort of packaged as a zombie film. And not because of what happens, right? Not because of, like, the twists, because I don't mind that, but because I don't actually think, even though the dead don't die, right? Like, even though that's happening, I don't feel like it reads as a zombie film. And I think that was one of my problems with it, is that I just don't feel... I feel like it is a more successful, quirky horror film than it is a zombie comedy film.
Well, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because Jim actually talked about in an interview with the Rolling Stones how he doesn't like zombies, period. It's the ironic thing. He says he's not a zombie fan, he's more of a vampire guy. He thinks they're more complicated, they're sexual, they're smart, they have a lot of difficult things they need to do to survive. He says that they're effing cool. What's cool about a zombie? They're lifeless forms, they're soulless humanoids. They're an excuse. So he doesn't really love zombies, but what he does talk about in this article is he likes the metaphorical things that you can do with zombies. He thinks they're indicative of the genre, the metaphorical ability of zombies from the very first one with George Romero. So he acknowledges that, and that's why he ultimately talks about in this article why he chose to include zombies, to get the metaphorical use of zombies in here with and to pair it with consumerism.
And again, I'm definitely willing to agree with that. I think if they had just said it's a quirky little horror film and then they left us to be like, oh, there's some zombie stuff, I would have had less of an issue with it. It's just that, again, and this is not the first nor will it be the last time that this will be an issue for me or you. Not that it is this time for you, but that's the packaging of a film, right?
Indeed.
A lot of times, the reason that a film doesn't work for me is in part because of how it was marketed and set up.
And I think that's a lot of, like, that explains a lot of the reaction to the film, is that a lot of people didn't think it delivered on what they were promised. So it was released at the Cannes Film Festival, May 14th, 2019. And then it got its larger release in the US, June 14th, and then July 12th in the United Kingdom. Made $14 million worldwide, and the critical and audience reception to the film was tepid at best. Pretty much like a split, like a dead split. Rotten Tomatoes, the critics have it at a 56%, audience have it at 38.
Ooh, wow.
IMDb has it at a 5.5 out of 10. Metacritic's critics gave it a 54. Audiences have a 5.2.
And if we're thinking about why the response might have been the way it is, I think that, again, some of it has to do with, like you said, like it wasn't the film that they thought they were going to be seeing, which we've talked about before as being a really important factor in determining people's responses to things.
Setting up audience's expectations is, I mean, what you promise the audience, you would better deliver.
Yes, and you had better deliver it without giving it all away beforehand, right? Which is the other extreme that oftentimes these marketing campaigns go to.
And this film was very much promoted as just like a laugh-a-minute zombie romp. Like, very much in, like, the style of, like, a Zombieland or a Shaun of the Dead.
Yes. And instead, it's really an example, like a quintessential example of the postmodern horror. So to go back to Pinedo, and again, like, it sounds like I am describing this film like as though she wrote about it, but she says the boundaries between living and dead, normal and abnormal, human and alien, and good and evil are blurred and sometimes indistinguishable. And in contrast to the classical horror film, the postmodern film locates the horror in the contemporary everyday world. Mm-hmm. And a little later she says, women play a more prominent role as both victims and heroes. The postmodern genre promotes a paranoid worldview in which inexplicable and increasingly internal threats to the social order prevail. And if you know that's what you're getting into at the start, the film becomes, I think, more palatable. If you're thinking that it's going to be more, as it was advertised, as, like you said, a Zombieland or Shaun of the Dead, it doesn't work. Just kind of across the board.
It might be to my benefit that I did not see it when it was in theaters, and so I rewatched the trailer before this, so I could just, like, see how it was promoted versus what it actually was. And bad trailer in terms of promoting actively the film itself.
Yes.
It doesn't articulate what the film is about at all, which is this postmodern, highly ironic take on the genre. So when I watched it, I didn't have any of those expectations fresh in my mind. All I knew was that you didn't like it. And so I was like, okay, well, I probably won't like it either, because we do tend to agree. But then I found myself rather enjoying it, and I was like, I wonder why this is. It could be because I didn't have the expectation of it being this bloody romp.
Right. And I think that's part of my dislike for it. I think this is maybe the only time where I'm going to cite your remedy to every film that you feel is slightly broken. And that is, I thought the film just needed to be significantly shorter. I thought it was incredibly self-indulgent. And not the good self-indulgent. So what upset me so much is there's so much, like, gold in there. Like, one of my favorite recurring, like, elements is the song on the radio.
I do enjoy that song.
I thought that was just because it's just so fantastic, right? Like, and that's one of those song. Like, sort of, like, very self-aware moments. Or I thought the whole diner sequence, I thought all of that was lovely with, like, you know, when the police arrive at the diner and there's the bodies. Like, I thought all of that worked.
Like the rule of three. Like,
yes.
3 different people walk into the diner and describe the scene exactly the same way.
Yes, like, there's just so many moments where, like, this is like, he knows his stuff. This is comedy horror.
And then they call back. Like, on the newscast later, it's just like, it looks like it could have been an animal. Or perhaps a few animals.
Yes, like, I just thought that was so great. But then there would be other moments in the film that it was just like, okay, somebody should have told you that there needed to be further editing. I think that's one of the risks of having a writer-director, is they have the best, like, vision of their own product.
But didn't you hear his quote about the editing process? Do you want me to read it again?
No, please don't. It was so gross. If the movie is his product.
Oh yeah. Oh God. Yeah. If this is the movie that he's made, and this is what he's equating wild sex to,
and like impregnation, like I just ew.
I would not describe this movie as wild sex.
No, I would describe it as
ironic sex
or sloppy sex. Like I'm gonna go there because I think that where it was sharp, it was super sharp, but too often it was just self-indulgent. And again, the sex metaphor works nicely, right?
It does work. It was very apt. It was very good work there.
It's just, it's supposed to be a consensual act, and I don't think I was always consenting with where we were headed. And thus ends our super gross, hopefully. This will be the end.
It'll die. I won't go on with it.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, we may.
The dead don't die, but this bit will.
Thank you for that. That was lovely. And I think really again, when I trace through, it's that every one of the storylines, or every one of the like little moments,
they're tableaus. I mean,
they are, but I didn't feel like. So I understand if we're going back to this definition of postmodern horror, we're going to not have the narrative closure we expect. And I don't need traditional narrative closure, but I do need for it to not feel as though at some point they were like, it'd be real great. What if, wait, what if we put in this bit about, like, I just felt like that not everything worked organically, and it could have even within a tableau construction.
See, I thought it did. I was worried that it wasn't going to work as organically as it did, because a lot of the tableaus initially seemed just totally in separate worlds, and I was like, I guess this does work very nicely within like the postmodern construct that this film is building up, and that there won't be like a satisfying closure, and that it's very just like in this moment it's bound experience because you're seeing all these different points in time. But then it actually kind of did everything in a way tie together, and so you didn't get proper narrative closure. I mean, you can't in a film that acknowledges it's a film and that these two main characters have read the script to this film. Which and
I was almost there for. I needed a little bit more setup. Like, I just felt like they couldn't. But yes, anyway, in a film that's literally acknowledging that it's a film.
You're never going to have that proper narrative closure. In a film that literally ends with Tilda Swinton going up to the aliens in the sky, and then the two heroes fighting the zombies and being consumed. Sure, you're not going to get proper narrative closure, but we did see the ends of every character that we had met along the way.
Yeah, so you're correct that we are...
I didn't think that every character was going to end up being necessary. I thought they had just like thrown in a lot of different characters just so they could have this ensemble cast and say like use that in the trailers or whatever. I was like, oh well, that'll be my knock against it, but I don't really think that's mine. I don't know.
No, you're correct. This was not one of those films where they got someone to be in it for 2 minutes so that they could say so and so's in the film. And you're also correct that we do have as much of a narrative closure as we're going to get for all the major sort of worlds, right? And then we see them interact. I think my problem is that somewhere between the introduction to these characters and these stories and the conclusion to them, there was something, I don't know, there was just something missing for me. And I think to go back to your example about when they're like referencing the script, I would have been so willing to buy that if there had been some setup to that ahead of time. It just felt like as the script was being written, there was like, it'd be kind of funny. What if we just put in this bit where they are, doing whatever? And that's how, and again, it goes back to this idea of self-indulgent. It just felt like rather than being a carefully worked out component, it was this would be funny. And if people don't get it, that's okay. They may not be able to get it because that's just maybe they're not good enough. Or like, I felt like that was the aesthetic.
I will agree that I don't think every single joke worked. And I think that specific joke did actually work for me. I just don't think it was as nearly as funny as they may have thought it was. But I got where it was coming from because Adam Driver at the beginning did keep saying, this is not going to go well. Or it's like, he's like, oh, I love this song. This is the theme song. The Dead Don't Die. Right. And so I'm like, okay, I see what this is. and then there's no comment from Bill Murray's character at all. The scene just goes on. So I was like, okay, I'm willing to go with this. I mean, that joke is not quite as funny as I think that everyone involved may have thought it was, but I appreciated it. It was like, I see what you're going for here and how it advances this postmodern, highly ironic atmosphere of this movie, which I think is the best part, is that while every little component may not be 100%, and I'm willing to acknowledge that there is quite a few deficiencies within the film, the atmosphere it does succeed in creating to me was one that I found rather enjoyable, and also why overall I think I did ultimately end up enjoying the film.
You know, I think you really hit the nail on the head for why I just don't think I'll ever be able to like it as much as you did. And that is, you said that you don't know if it worked as well as they seem to think that it did. And it kind of reminded me of like outtakes where, you know, whenever they're put in the movie and you're like, these are not as funny as you all remember them being. Or it's one of the reasons why, and this is going to make me sound super like bah humbug, I don't really like weddings, because like unless you're intimately involved with that couple, like know them really well, it just feels like one giant inside joke that you're not a part of. And you're like, that's real swell, strangers. And I felt like that was what this movie was. It was a delightful experience for them that translated into a okay experience for me.
And I think I liked the experience. For whatever reason, I think I do know what reason.
Yeah, I was
think
gonna say.
I enjoy postmodern things more than you do. It seems like, and so naturally, if I like the elements of postmodern more, I'm in on more of the jokes because that's what I like. That's the type of stuff I gravitate towards, and so it works for me.
You like improv as a concept more than I do.
I
like being part of improv, but I don't like experiencing it the way you do. And this is really just a filmed improv that just happened to have been already scripted. You know what I mean? Like, it had that kind of same feel to it in many ways.
Like a loose kind of freeform.
A loose freeformy feel, we invite you into our jokes, and in this moment you're part of us, but then we'll set you back free feel that I just works for you, and clearly doesn't for me.
Yeah. So I think ultimately, if you're a fan of postmodern works or like highly ironic comedy that knows it thinks it's above the joke, it's assuming you will go with them and indulge them with the jokes, I think you'll like this movie. I don't love this movie, but I liked it. I thought it was a good time. I enjoyed it. I didn't have nearly as strong of a negative reaction to this film as you ultimately did. So if you're a fan of postmodern works, I think you should check it out. I quite enjoyed it.
And I think if you have the time and even are not necessarily a fan of these things, it is worth seeing, if only because I think that films that are aware of the horror genre are worth seeing. Films that are like aware of all the things that have been happening, all the things that will be happening, trends and all that stuff. That is something that as a horror fan or scholar, you should be aware of. You should be aware of what does horror have to say about itself. And so in that respect, there are worse ways you could spend a couple hours. There are better ways, but there are worse ways too.
Definitely worse ways. And the cast does some good work.
Some good work. I mean, you really, anything that's going to have Bill Murray and Tilda Swinton in it together, I mean,
Tilda Swinton at this point has just got the market cornered on a whole type of characters.
Which, good for her.
Honestly, yeah. She made her own character type.
She did. She said, you know what? I am not, happily not, the ideal, quote, ideal female actress. So guess what? I'm going to make my own ideal female character. And she's delightful. Yes, and she's very good in this film. She's actually, I think she's one of my favorite parts.
I also think I'll say she is my favorite part.
Yeah, I think she might be too. Which is why I actually didn't have any problem with the alien thing, because I was like, oh good, she can do it. She's already communicating that alienness.
Yeah.
So for our next film, we are going to be once more in agreement, because I know how stressful you all find it.
Yeah, when we fight.
That's right. It's just, I know that you're just sitting there, like, with bated breath, and hoping that we will once again say, yes, we feel the same way. And that is for the 2017 film, The Babysitter, which is going to be our third film that is a horror comedy in a row in terms of our discussion for the podcast, but mainly because we've talked about some super dark films, and so we wanted to just, lighten things up for a little bit.
So, The Babysitter is available on Netflix. It's a Netflix original film, so you can either use your Netflix account to watch the film, or you can borrow one of your friends' passwords. And
or watch it with them. That would be an even better option.
Human interaction.
Yes, human interaction and a delightful horror comedy.
A good
What more could you ask for?
Nothing. That's it. That's all you ask for.
Yeah, pretty much.
So a quick check-in. Now it's the end. A review of my ultimate behavior. I knew at the top you said you didn't know whether or not.
Yes, so you became much more palatable as the episode progressed. Now, I don't know how you're going to end this episode, so it's very possible you're going to go weird again.
I wasn't planning on it.
Oh, I have put ideas in his head. Bad. Quick, we must end the podcast before his ideas have chance to take root. Please like us as always. If you have something exciting or even not exciting that you want to share with us, do so on social media. And join us for our next episode on The Babysitter.
Bye-bye.
Yep, that was a little weird.
Okay, well then I did end it on a little bit of a weird note. I'll say just goodbye.
Also weird.